One of the biggest misconceptions people have about empaths is that their emotional, free awareness makes them nearly impossible to surprise. Because they are highly attuned to emotional cues, subtle shifts in behavior, and the unspoken dynamics between people, they often develop a strong confidence in their ability to understand others. Over time, this confidence can become something more than intuition. It can become certainty. And certainty is where the blind spot begins. An empath may spend months, years, or even decades studying the people around them. They notice changes in tone, body language, energy, and motivation. They become skilled at predicting reactions before they happen. They can often tell when someone is hurt before that person says a word. They can sense tension in a room before anyone acknowledges it. These abilities are real, and they can be incredibly valuable. But there is a hidden danger that comes with being right so often. When someone accurately predicts human behavior over and over again, they can start believing that the future itself is predictable. They begin to assume they know how a story will end because they have become familiar with the characters involved. They stop observing and start expecting. Psychology teaches us that expectations are powerful filters. We don't simply see reality as it is. We often see reality as we expect it to be. Once a person forms a strong narrative about someone, every new piece of information tends to be interpreted through that narrative. This is why people are often shocked when someone changes dramatically. They aren't reacting to the change itself. They're reacting to the collapse of the story they had been telling themselves. An empath may believe they understand your weaknesses, your emotional patterns, your fears, and your habits. They may know exactly how you've responded to disappointment in the past. They may know how quickly you forgive, how much rejection affects you, or how often you've returned after being hurt. And because they know those things, they may unconsciously assume those patterns are permanent. But human beings are not fixed identities. We are processes. We are constantly changing, adapting, learning, and evolving. The person someone understood a year ago may not be the person standing before them today. This is where your final move begins to create an impact they never expected. The move isn't dramatic. It isn't loud. It isn't fueled by revenge. In fact, that's precisely why it becomes so powerful. Instead of reacting the way you always reacted, you respond differently. Instead of chasing answers, you create distance. Instead of demanding understanding, you focus on growth. Instead of proving your value, you invest in yourself. Suddenly, the emotional script they had memorized no longer works. And when someone's predictions stop working, they are forced into a state of uncertainty. Uncertainty is psychologically uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of control. People feel safest when they believe they know what comes next. The moment they realize they don't, curiosity begins to replace confidence. Questions begin to replace conclusions. They start wondering what changed. They start replaying conversations. They start searching for signs they missed, and perhaps most importantly, they begin confronting a possibility they never seriously considered, that they didn't know you as well as they thought. There is something profoundly humbling about realizing another person possesses depths you never explored. Philosophers throughout history have pointed to the mystery that exists within every human being. No matter how closely we study someone, there is always more beneath the surface. There are decisions being made internally that no observer can fully see. The strongest transformations often happen in silence, not during arguments, not during explanations, not during dramatic announcements, but during private moments when a person decides they will no longer live according to an outdated version of themselves. That decision changes everything. Because the moment you stop behaving according to someone else's expectations, you reclaim authorship over your own life. You stop being a character in their story and become the writer of your own. And that is often the moment they realize something they never expected. The person they thought they understood was only the person you used to be. The moment someone can no longer predict your future from your past is the moment they discover how much of you they never truly knew. Once that realization begins to settle in, that they can no longer predict you the way they once did, something even more significant starts to happen beneath the surface. The issue is no longer simply that you've changed. The issue is that your absence has removed something they didn't fully realize they depended on. Most people think emotional attachment is only about affection, love, or connection. But psychology reveals something more complex. Human relationships often serve as mirrors. We learn who we are, how we're doing, and what influence we have by observing the reactions of other people. Every meaningful relationship becomes a source of feedback. Consciously or unconsciously, we look into the lives of others and see reflections of ourselves. For many empaths, this dynamic is especially powerful. Empaths are naturally drawn toward understanding people. They pay attention to emotional patterns. They invest energy into helping, supporting, guiding, and sometimes rescuing others. They often become the person others turn to during moments of confusion, pain, or uncertainty. Over time, this role can become deeply intertwined with their identity. Without realizing it, they may begin to define part of their worth through their ability to impact other people's lives. Now, this isn't necessarily selfish. In many cases, it comes from a genuine desire to help. But even healthy motivations can create subtle dependencies. When someone spends years being the listener, the healer, the advisor, or the emotional anchor, they become accustomed to seeing evidence of their importance, reflected back through the people they support. And that's where your departure creates a disruption they never expected. When you completely withdraw your attention, your emotional availability, and your participation in the dynamic, something disappears. The mirror goes with you. Suddenly, they no longer know how you're feeling. They don't know what you're thinking. They don't know whether you're struggling, succeeding, missing them, forgetting them, or moving on. The stream of information they once relied on is gone. Human beings are remarkably uncomfortable with unanswered questions. Neuroscientists have found that uncertainty often occupies more mental energy than certainty, even when the certainty is unpleasant. A difficult truth is easier for the mind to process than an unresolved mystery. This is why people sometimes think more about the opportunities they lost than the ones they still have. The mind naturally revisits unfinished stories. When you disappear emotionally, you become one of those unfinished stories. The empath who once felt connected to your inner world now encounters silence, where information used to exist. And silence has a unique psychological effect. Silence invites projection. People begin filling in the blanks. They imagine scenarios. They replay memories. They search for meaning. They construct explanations. And because there are no new facts available, their minds often return to the past repeatedly, hoping to find answers hidden in conversations they thought they already understood. This creates an emotional vacuum. A vacuum isn't painful because something negative enters. It's painful because something familiar leaves. The routine disappears. The emotional access disappears. The sense of influence disappears. The ability to monitor your emotional state disappears. And in that absence, they are forced to confront something many people avoid confronting: the difference between connection and control. True connection respects another person's freedom. Control, even in its most subtle forms, depends upon access. When access disappears, any illusion of control disappears with it. Your final move may have been nothing more than reclaiming your attention and directing it toward your own growth. Yet from the other side, that decision can feel profound, because it changes the entire structure of the relationship. For perhaps the first time, they are unable to measure their impact on your life. And that uncertainty can linger far longer than anyone expects. Philosophically, this speaks to a deeper truth about human existence. Every person we meet contains an inner world that ultimately belongs to them alone. No matter how close we become, no matter how much we understand someone, there is a boundary we cannot cross. We can witness another person's journey, but we cannot possess it. The moment you stopped providing a window into your inner world, that boundary became visible. And boundaries have a way of revealing realities people previously ignored. What haunts people is rarely the loss of control itself. What haunts them is realizing they mistook access for permanence. Because once someone learns how to live fully without your observation, your approval, or your involvement, they become a reminder of a truth that is difficult to escape. The people who matter most are never ours to keep. They are only ours to appreciate while they choose to stay. Once someone loses access to your inner world, something interesting begins to happen. In the absence of new information, The human mind does what it has always done. It relies on memory. And memory, despite how trustworthy it feels, is not a perfect record of reality. It is a reconstruction. It simplifies. It edits. It freezes moments in time and quietly presents them as if they still exist. This is where many people make one of the most significant psychological mistakes of their lives. They assume the person they remember is the person who still exists. Think about that for a moment. Most people are not reacting to who you are today. They are reacting to the version of you they stored in their mind months or years ago. They interact with a memory, not a reality. They speak to an old identity, long after that identity has been abandoned. And empaths are not immune to this. In fact, because empaths often pay such close attention to emotional details, they can develop highly detailed mental models of the people around them. They remember your struggles. They remember your fears. They remember the conversations where you doubted yourself. They remember the moments when you needed reassurance, guidance, or support. Over time, these memories become a framework through which they interpret you. The problem is that human beings are not photographs. We are not static images frozen in a single moment of our development. We are living systems constantly adapting to experience. Every challenge changes us. Every disappointment teaches us something. Every loss reshapes our priorities. Every victory expands our confidence. The person who suffered yesterday is not automatically the same person who wakes up tomorrow. Yet many people never update their perception. Psychologists sometimes describe this tendency as cognitive anchoring. Once we form a strong impression of someone, future information struggles to displace that original image. Even when evidence of growth exists, the old story often remains emotionally dominant. That is why transformation frequently surprises people, not because transformation is rare, but because observers are often looking at an outdated version of the individual. Imagine someone who once struggled with self-worth. For years, they tolerated poor treatment, accepted less than they deserved, and constantly sought validation from others. The people around them became accustomed to that version of them. It became familiar. Then something changes. Perhaps they begin healing. Perhaps they start setting boundaries. Perhaps they invest in their education, their purpose, their health, or their discipline. Perhaps they spend months confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves and deciding to grow beyond them. The transformation does not happen overnight. Most meaningful change never does. It happens quietly, day after day, choice after choice, habit after habit, until eventually a completely different person emerges. The fascinating part is that the individual undergoing the transformation often notices it last. Growth feels gradual from the inside, but from the outside, it can appear dramatic. One day, people suddenly realize they are no longer dealing with the same person they once knew. The old emotional triggers no longer work. The old manipulations no longer work. The old expectations no longer work. The predictable reactions disappear. And this creates a psychological shock, because now they must confront an uncomfortable reality. They underestimated your capacity for growth. Human beings consistently underestimate transformation. We assume people will remain roughly the same because it makes the world easier to predict. Stability feels safe. Change introduces uncertainty. But history, philosophy, and psychology all point toward the same conclusion. Change is not the exception. Change is the rule. Everything alive evolves. Everything alive adapts. Everything alive moves. The greatest mistake someone can make is assuming another person's current limitations define their future potential. When empaths look back, they may remember the person who needed understanding. They may remember the person who struggled, who questioned themselves, who searched for answers. What they often do not anticipate is encountering someone who has already found them. Someone who no longer seeks permission to grow. Someone who no longer negotiates their worth. Someone who has learned to stand comfortably in their own identity. And perhaps that is what feels so unsettling. Not that you became successful. Not that you moved on. Not that you changed. But that you changed beyond the boundaries of their expectations. The version of you they understood became obsolete. And when someone realizes they have been relating to a memory rather than a living person, they are forced to face a truth that applies to every relationship in life. If you are not growing, your past will define you. But if you are growing, there will come a day when even the people who knew you best no longer recognize the person you have become. By the time someone realizes that the version of you they remember no longer exists, another emotion often begins to emerge. It doesn't arrive all at once. It develops slowly, quietly, and sometimes years after the relationship, friendship, or connection has ended. That emotion is regret. Regret is one of the most fascinating experiences in human psychology because it is not caused by what happened. It is caused by what could have happened. The mind becomes trapped between reality and possibility. It starts comparing the life that exists to the life that might have existed if different choices had been made. And in many ways, that comparison can be more powerful than any actual loss. Think about how the human mind works. When a chapter closes permanently, we don't simply remember the events themselves. We revisit the crossroads. We replay the decisions. We examine the moments when a different outcome was still possible. This is why opportunities often become more valuable after they disappear. When something is available, people tend to assume it will remain available. There is always tomorrow. There is always another conversation. There is always another chance to apologize, to appreciate, to understand, or to repair what has been damaged. But life rarely operates according to those assumptions. One of the most difficult lessons adulthood teaches is that some opportunities are temporary. Some doors close, some seasons end, and once they do, no amount of wishing can recreate the conditions that once existed. This is where your final move begins to take on a deeper significance. Because your final move was not an argument. It was not revenge. It was not a dramatic attempt to prove a point. Your final move was continuing your life. That sounds simple, but psychologically it carries enormous weight. Many people expect conflict to be the end of a story. They assume the last argument, the final disagreement, or the painful goodbye is what defines the ending. In reality, endings are often defined by what happens afterward. You kept moving. You kept growing. You kept building. You kept healing. And with every step forward, the possibility of returning to the old dynamic became smaller. What haunts people is not always the loss itself. Often, what haunts them is the realization that they had more influence over the outcome than they once believed. As long as blame can be assigned entirely to circumstances, there is a certain comfort. But when someone begins recognizing their own missed opportunities, the experience becomes more personal. They remember the conversations they dismissed, the moments they failed to listen, the appreciation they never expressed, the effort they took for granted, the chances they assumed would always be there. And because human beings are meaning-making creatures, they naturally ask themselves a question that can echo for years. What if? What if I had been more honest? What if I had paid closer attention? What if I had valued the connection while I still had it? What if I had acted before it was too late? These questions are powerful because they can never be fully answered. The future that might have existed remains forever inaccessible. Philosophers have long argued that much of human suffering comes not from reality itself, but from resistance to reality. Regret is often a form of resistance. It is the mind attempting to negotiate with a past that no longer exists. But the past cannot be renegotiated. Time moves in one direction, and that fact gives every decision its significance. The irony is that many people only recognize the value of something when they are forced to imagine life without it. Distance creates perspective. Absence reveals importance. What once felt ordinary begins to appear extraordinary in hindsight. By the time the realization arrives, however, you are no longer standing where they left you. You have continued evolving. The version of you they wish they had appreciated is now part of history, and the person standing before them today is someone they never had the chance to know. That is why true closure rarely comes from getting another opportunity. It comes from accepting that some opportunities belong to a specific moment in time. When that moment passes, the lesson remains, even if the possibility does not. And perhaps that is the deepest truth hidden within regret. The opportunities that shape our lives are rarely the ones we lose unexpectedly. They are the ones we assumed would still be waiting when we finally decided to value them. After all of this, the uncertainty, the loss of access, the realization that you have changed, and the weight of opportunities that can never be revisited, we arrive at the part of the story that most people misunderstand. They assume your final move was something you did to them. They imagine it was a strategy, a punishment, a calculated act designed to make them feel the consequences of their choices. But in reality, the most powerful final move is rarely directed at another person at all. It is directed inward. It is the moment you stop organizing your life around what someone else thinks, feels, wants, or expects, and begin organizing it around your own growth. This is where true transformation begins. Most people, when hurt, become trapped in a cycle of reaction. Their attention remains fixed on the person who disappointed them. They replay conversations. They imagine future confrontations. They search for ways to explain themselves, defend themselves, or prove their worth. The problem is that all of those responses still place the other person at the center of the story. And as long as someone else remains the center of your story, they continue to influence the direction of your life. Growth begins when that influence ends. Psychologically speaking, one of the greatest shifts a human being can experience is moving from external validation to internal validation. In simple terms, this means your sense of value no longer depends on someone else's recognition. You stop asking, "Do they see my worth?" and start asking, "Am I living in alignment with my worth?" That change sounds subtle, but it alters everything, because now your energy is no longer invested in convincing people. It is invested in becoming. You focus on your health. You focus on your discipline. You focus on your purpose. You focus on developing skills, building meaningful relationships, expanding your understanding, and creating a life that reflects your values. And something remarkable happens during this process. The need for closure begins to disappear. Not because you suddenly forget the past, not because the past stops mattering, but because your future becomes more compelling than your history. Many people spend years trying to win emotional battles that no longer matter. They seek apologies that may never come. They chase explanations that would not change anything even if they received them. But growth offers something far more valuable than explanation. It offers freedom. Freedom from needing everyone to understand you. Freedom from needing everyone to agree with you. Freedom from needing everyone to recognize your value before you recognize it yourself. This is why genuine self-development is so powerful. It changes the source of your confidence. Instead of confidence coming from attention, it comes from competence. Instead of confidence coming from approval, it comes from integrity. Instead of confidence coming from being chosen, it comes from choosing yourself. And this is often the point that surprises people the most, because they expected pain to make you weaker. They expected disappointment to make you bitter. They expected rejection to make you desperate for validation. What they did not anticipate was that hardship would become the catalyst for your evolution. Philosophically, this reflects one of the oldest ideas in human history. Across cultures and centuries, wisdom traditions have pointed toward the same principle. Suffering becomes transformative when it is used as material for growth. The obstacle becomes the teacher. The setback becomes the lesson. The wound becomes the source of wisdom. When approached correctly, adversity does not diminish a person. It refines them. And that refinement creates a kind of strength that cannot be taken away because it was earned internally. This is why your growth becomes the most unforgettable part of the story. Not because it was loud, not because it demanded attention, but because it demonstrated something undeniable. You did not need revenge to move forward. You did not need validation to heal. You did not need permission to become more than you once were. Your final move was not making someone regret losing you. Your final move was becoming someone who no longer needed to be found. And that is the ultimate lesson hidden within every meaningful transformation. The moment you stop chasing recognition and start pursuing growth, you become impossible to ignore, and even more importantly, impossible to control.